Hi there, and thank you for joining us for today's reading of The Earl, Her Reluctant Guardian by Warise Woodson, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Chapter 1. From the view out her carriage window, Vanessa Ann Rivington scanned the trees flashing by. The coach had picked up speed for some reason. Her heart thumped in rhythm with the jingling of the harnesses and the creaking of the coach as it raced over the hard-packed roadway. Something was definitely wrong. The outrider thundered up to the window on his horse and yelled, "You ladies hold tight and duck down. Thieves is riding up on us." Her traveling companion cried, "Dear Lord, we are going to be murdered, robbed, then hacked to pieces. Only yesterday I heard—" The woman's abrupt silence indicated hysterics would soon follow. That would never do. Vanessa patted her companion's hand. "Mrs. Latham, calm yourself. The guard will protect us. That's why he was hired to ride with the coach." Vanessa opened her reticule and pulled out her pistol. Uncle Charlie had always insisted she carry a weapon upon the rare occasion she traveled home to Hill House from the Young Ladies' Academy beyond Bath near the village of Sheffield. Her throat tightened and tears filled her eyes. Uncle Charlie would no longer be at Hill House to greet her, but this was not the proper time or place to allow tears of sorrow to overwhelm her. She blinked the moisture from her eyes. Vanessa peered out the window and caught her breath. Indeed, 3 men with masks over their faces and pistols drawn were riding hard after the coach. A shot rang out and she jerked back, watching in horror as the coachman tumbled from his perch and rolled on the ground. The horses snorted and careened out of control. With every muscle in her body tensed, she clung to the strap above the seat. The carriage bounced in and out of a deep rut, followed by a loud, explosive crack, sending the frightened animals into a frenzy. The scream of splintering wood filled the coach as the shaft convulsed, allowing the panicked horses to break free. The carriage swayed, nearly overturning before it verged into the underbrush beside the road and crashed into a tree. Vanessa was thrown to the floor with Mrs. Latham on top of her. After a few minutes, her mind cleared, and Vanessa came to herself. Her head ached, and the previously aloof Mrs. Latham's loud weeping made the situation worse. "Mrs. Latham, please hush and move off of me. I can hardly breathe." Mrs. Latham struggled upright and moved onto the tilted seat. She sobbed into her handkerchief. Vanessa lifted her skirts and spied her pistol at her feet. Scooping up her weapon, she scrambled onto the other banquette and sank back with her hand at her chest to halt the pounding of her heart. After taking a minute to compose herself and to listen intently, she leaned out of the window to take a quick peek in both directions. There was no sign of the guard or the crooks. No one. Only the distant, slowly fading beat of running horses reached her over Mrs. Latham's whimpering. "Mrs. Latham, are you injured in any way?" Her traveling companion peered at Vanessa over her handkerchief. "My nerves are shattered. I may have one of my spasms if something isn't done to recuse me this instant." Exasperated with the woman, Vanessa fought to keep her tone civil. "This is a well-traveled road. Someone will come along to help us." She wanted to slap some sense into Mrs. Latham's wilted, self-pitying head. "I intend to walk back the way we came to discover how badly the coachman is injured. Perhaps I can render aid." Mrs. Latham cried, "No, I shall perish with fear if you leave me all alone." "I shan't be long. He should be a little way beyond the bend in the road. If you are afraid to remain here by yourself, accompany me." With that, Vanessa climbed out of the coach, wrapped her cloak snugly around her, gripped her pistol, and walked away. Oh dear, wait, I'm coming." Vanessa continued to pace down the road, but she slowed her gait to give Mrs. Latham time to clamber out of the coach and follow her. When the woman caught up, Vanessa glanced sideways at her, noting her scowl and the grim expression on her rather thin face. Her dark hair streaked with gray and pulled back in a severed bun beneath her bonnet did nothing to soften her gaunt features or her wiry frame. She huffed while stomping along beside Vanessa. After several minutes of brisk walking, a gust of wind brought the faint sound of male voices from up ahead. Vanessa halted in mid-stride to listen. Apprehension gripped her, and her heart beat a little faster. Were the crooks still around? Where was the guard? The rustling in the undergrowth added tension to her already stretched nerves. Mrs. Latham nearly bumped into her. "What is wrong? What do you mean by stopping in front of me like that? I could have tripped and been hurt." "Do be quiet. I heard something." The other woman gasped. What if it's the thieves come to slay us after all? Will you be silent? Vanessa gripped her pistol tighter and slowly moved forward. She edged to the side of the road and peered through the trees, viewing the area where the roadway swerved around the bend. The voices became louder. Partially hidden by the stand of birch and plane trees, Vanessa crept around the bend. She witnessed the guard with his hands raised in anger while he shouted at another gentleman in front of him, obviously a dandy in his jacket of bright jonquil with padded shoulders to an absurd height. Since neither of the men were brandishing weapons, only loud voices in an argument, she determined the scene was safe enough and strode forward. As she moved closer, she inspected the other gentleman. He was slender and of average height, with blond hair and an unremarkable countenance. His muddy green eyes were trained on her and were his most striking feature, yet ordinary but for the color. Seems we have company. The stranger cast a disarming smile toward Vanessa and bowed. Ladies. The guard shifted under Mrs. Latham's scrutiny. Glad to see you ladies ain't hurt none. Mrs. Latham sniffed. No thanks to you. She glared at the stranger through narrowed lids. Are you one of them, the murdering thieves? No, ma'am. You are quite safe now? When I arrived on the scene, the villains fled. I fired at the cowards, but I don't think I did any damage. The guard glanced at Vanessa. This here is one Mr. Carrington Sedgwick. He's heading to Rivenville. When he arrives, he can make arrangements to send a coach back for us. I'd be honored to do so, but I'm not going all the way to Rivenville. I intend to cut through the woods to Hill House. From there, I'll send one of my carriages back for all of you. His carriages? Vanessa nearly fainted. Her pulse drummed in her ears and she fisted her hands. Why was this person laying claim to Hill House and the carriages? The estate belonged to her. Hill House had been hers ever since the death of her father all those years ago. The hard metal in her hand reminded her she still had her pistol at her side. She slipped her weapon into the pocket of her skirt and cleared her throat. Send one of your carriages, is it? From Hill House? The Sedgwick gentleman bowed his head to her. Indeed. Hill House belonged to my stepfather, Mr. Charles Rivington, and now belongs to my mother. Mrs. Latham cried. Oh, if you would be so kind. My nerves are beyond irritated. I shall be fortunate if this incident doesn't bring on one of my spasms. Shocked to learn her step relations were not only occupying Hill House, but claiming the estate as well, Vanessa clutched the cameo at her throat. A present from Uncle Charlie. Naturally, as her guardian, Uncle Charlie had lived in her home. He'd married and brought his wife to Hill House, but he died shortly thereafter. Why were her step-relatives still living in her home? Why did this fellow imagine his mother owned Hill House? Dismay rumbled through her, and she stroked her eyebrow with one finger to quiet her headache while calming the emotions roiling inside of her. The guard rubbed his chin. This here is Miss Vanessa Rivington of Hill House. I take it you two haven't met up before. Carrington's eyes held a moment of surprise before narrowing with a flash of cunning. Ah, my step-cousin at long last. Rumor did not do you justice. You are more than lovely. You are beautiful. His words of admiration did not match his expression, which was calculating and smug. As my dear cousin, you may call me Carrie. The guard took one aggressive stride closer to Carrington. Did you happen to see the coachman somewhere back down the way? Indeed. He's lying under an oak tree beside the road. He's only bruised a bit, and I think he may have a broken rib or two, perhaps even his leg. Other than that, a bullet nicked him, but nothing serious there. The guard raised his head and mocked. You a doc, are you? Of course not, but I do have common sense. Carrington shook his head as if extremely annoyed at the question. He is not near death at the moment. He does need a doctor, however. When I reach Hill House, I shall send word to the doctor in Rivenville and to expect him. What is to become of me? Mrs. Latham whined. The guard glanced at her. It's my duty to see both you and Miss Rivington safe. So far, you have failed in your duty, allowing ruffians to attempt to rob this conveyance, shooting, and causing a wreck against a tree. We might have been killed. Perhaps I should report your conduct to your supervisor. Mrs. Latham gave a sarcastic smile. When you deliver my person to the coaching inn in Rivenville, I shall reconsider your behavior. Between his teeth, the guard uttered, Happy to oblige, madam. Can't hardly wait to deposit you quick-like safely at that there inn. He frowned at Carrie's snicker. I shall make certain of my cousin's safe arrival at Hill House while you accompany the others to Rivenville in one of my carriages. Carrie turned to Vanessa and raised a brow. If my arrangements are satisfactory to Miss Rivington? Vanessa nodded. What else could she do? Besides, she wanted to arrive at Hill House the soonest. She needed to view the situation firsthand, to inspect her recently acquired aunt, to discover exactly what authority her aunt retained over Hill House and the servants. With a satisfied grin, Carrie headed for his horse. Speaking of which, I must be off. He mounted the magnificent chestnut and galloped away. Vanessa caught a shaky breath as she considered her recently acquired stepfamily still in residence at Hill House. She'd not previously met her Aunt Bernice or step-cousin Carrie. There had not been time. Uncle Charlie had died nearly a year after the marriage. In all of that time, she'd never been home. Trepidation washed through her. The prospect of strangers in her home seemed nearly unbearable. If only Uncle Charlie still lived, but he was gone, leaving her very much alone in the world. Tears threatened in earnest. Vanessa appreciated the offer of one of her carriages, but the distance to Hill House must be farther than Carrie had indicated. The length of time to ride to Hill House and send 2 carriages back for them had taken considerably longer than anticipated or indicated by her step-cousin. The chilled air could not be good for the injured coachman. It was late in the afternoon now, with the sun hovering barely over the treetops, painting the clouds with a soft rose hue, along with brilliant oranges and greens as well. Finally, Vanessa could sit still no longer. Agitated at the wait, she paced back and forth for several minutes before viewing 2 carriages approaching. Hopefully, the coaches were sent by her cousin Carrie. She drew a sigh of relief as the conveyances pulled to a halt. Both were sent from Hill House. After much discussion between the guard and the coachman, they lifted the injured man inside. She patted Mrs. Latham's hand and assisted her into the coach. Vanessa finally climbed into the other carriage, grateful to be on the final lap of the journey to her home. She straightened her skirts and accidentally brushed her pistol. Removing the weapon from her pocket, she placed the gun back in her reticule and allowed a weary sigh to escape. This had been a dreadful day, and she could hardly wait for it to end.